Hey, it's Sarah Burke here from the Women in Media podcast. And before we get started on a new episode, could I get you to hit like, follow, subscribe, hit the bell, whichever app you do your podcast listening in. Make sure you're all set up so you know when there's a new episode and you can help spread the word. Oh, and if you're so inclined, could I ask you to leave a review if the app that you're using does that? You're the best. All right, let's get to the show. I'm Sarah Burke, and this is the Women in Media podcast. I'm joined by a woman who's literally been the face of Sportsnet since its inception in 1998. That's 24 years of features, event coverage, and reporting.
You know you've been doing this long enough when I'm now interviewing the sons of hockey players that I used to interview Ty Domi. Now I interview Max Domi. And all the guys that I started out interviewing are now the coaches and the GMs and management.
She's currently their NHL reporter. Her interviews appear on Hockey Night in Canada, Scotiabank Wednesday Night Hockey, and The Big Picture with Chris Simpson. Welcome to the Women in Media podcast. I'm so honored you said yes.
Well, Sarah, thank you so much for the invitation. I appreciate it.
A very foggy Thursday in Toronto. What's the day look like?
First of all, it's a sad day since we've just gotten the news that Boria Salming has passed. And, I think every hockey fan at least, just 2 weeks ago almost now, saw Boria for the first time and the effects of ALS on him. And I'm so grateful that he had the chance not only to see so many of his former teammates, Daryl Sittler, Matt Sundin came in for it, Lanny McDonald, but got to hear the roar from the Maple Leafs fans, the crowd that loved him so much. But to see him that recently and now just to know he's gone is incredibly sad. So that's the sad part. The fun part I'm looking forward to, I'm prepping for an interview I'm going to be doing with Mike Greer, the general manager of the San Jose Sharks, who will be in town next Wednesday to take on the Maple Leafs. And his story, an impressive one, not only, a former player over 1,000 games in the NHL, but the first Black general manager in the NHL. So I really am looking forward to chatting with him, and that will be on The Big Picture next Wednesday.
Very cool. So when I was reading about The Big Picture, this didn't really seem like something that Sportsnet put on you. It seemed like something you developed. Am I right there?
Well, I will give credit where credit is due. It was, we were sitting there in the pandemic going, what are we going to do? How are we going to fill our airwaves, and how am I going to do interviews when you're not allowed to be in the same room with someone? So two of our producers, our amazing producers, Jeremy McElhaney and Michael Addick, kind of came up with this idea, kind of pitched me on it, to be honest, and said, what do you think? I'm like, I am game. If it means that I can still talk to hockey players, let's do it. So, we're now into the third season of doing it. And the nice thing too, and even kind of started last year, but this year in particular, it is nice to be able to sometimes be in the same room with I did one a couple of weeks ago with John Tortorella, the head coach of the Philadelphia Flyers. And instead of it being Zoom in our studio, those are fun too, because it does allow you to sometimes get people that are a little more difficult to pin down from a scheduling standpoint.
Very true.
But to have the availability to be in the same room with them, because it makes it so much easier when you can actually be face to face. So it's been fun to at least have that segment that can, include not only players, GMs, but just sort of personalities and people who love the game from all walks of life. So it's been a lot of fun. The pandemic forced us all to look at things a little differently, right? So you pivot to figure out what you can do.
Yeah, it made us get comfortable with things that we were just not expecting at all.
Exactly.
So going back to the beginning of your career, I want to backtrack a little bit here. Was it 98 that was the beginning of you as a reporter? I know I was just reading you went to Western. I had no idea you grew up in London, Ontario. I was there for a decade of my career in school. So I love that city.
Did not realize that. Yeah, born and raised in London, Ontario. And I will say though, I kind of fell into this, and I will say, if Sportsnet wasn't a brand new sports television network looking for, kind of people from all walks of life, they just didn't want to steal everyone from TSN. That was the only other big, sports network at the time. They took a chance on me because I certainly didn't have conventional training. I mean, I went to Western, but I didn't take sports broadcasting at Western.
What did you take?
Well, I got a general social science degree. So I took a little bit of everything. I kept thinking, okay, I'm going to find that one thing that I love and I'm going to major in it. But I kind of liked a little bit of everything. I mean, I did take journalism 20, but I took business, I took psychology, I took anthropology, I took English. I kind of took a little bit of everything. And after graduating, moved to Toronto. But in the beginning, I worked in fashion. I worked with Marilyn Brooks, a Canadian designer. I did modeling for a while, did some commercials, did fashion shows, did lots of different things, but really started combining, I guess professionally was doing more marketing and PR, worked with Roots doing that, worked on the 96 Toronto Olympic bid. But then when I landed at the Hockey Hall of Fame as the marketing manager, that was the first time where sort of my, whatever business acumen I had in the marketing and PR worlds to combine with my longtime love of the game of hockey. So it kind of came together, but still, I, again, did not have the kind of experience that I would say anybody needs to be able to get into this industry. But anyone in this industry knows there is not a straight line to get to where, you and I both are. Everyone has a story of how they found their way.
And I read that you were the first ever in-game host for the Toronto Maple Leafs, former in-game host for the London Knights here, and I've done some World Juniors.
No.
So that's a fun gig, right?
A great gig. And that came about so funny because at the Hall of Fame, our phone directory system at the time, if you called the Hockey Hall of Fame, it'd be my voice saying, "Welcome to the Hockey Hall of Fame. We are open 7 days a week." So Bob Stellick at the time was the head of marketing for the Toronto Maple Leafs. And of course, I got to know him dealing with the Leafs as, in my position with the Hall of Fame. But I guess he called the hall enough that he was really, I really like her voice. She's got a good voice. So when it came time in 95 for the Leafs to hire an in-arena host, and they only did it because the Raptors came to town, and they knew that NBA in-game entertainment was a lot more than the Leafs were doing at that time.
Yeah.
So I'll never forget him pitching me on, like, what do you think? We think we need this in-arena host. And I'm thinking from a marketing standpoint, great idea, Bob, because then your sponsors will get a higher profile of, what you're doing with them. Their promotions will be seen and heard. And he's like, great, I want you to do it. I'm like, what? I don't know how to do that. But, you get thrown into it. You get a mic put in your hand and you're speaking live to, an arena of 18,000 people. And it started really my comfort level in what it's like to be live in front of a lot of people with a microphone in your hand.
Interesting, because most people in news, they're starting with like pre-recorded newscasts and things where there's not really a full audience. So, yeah, you really got thrown right in.
I was definitely thrown right into it.
Do you remember anything not going as planned in the early days? Because what we see of Christine Simpson now is so perfect. I have to ask.
Oh, that's so funny. Well, I will actually share something. Any nerves that I would have had prior to my first game of doing that kind of went out the window because I'll never forget the night before I was doing the game, my house was broken into. My house was robbed. And so I was so focused on, oh my God, and dealing with all of that the next day it was like, oh, right. And I'm starting this gig with the Leafs. I wonder what it's going to be like. But when you're somewhat distracted by real life things, sometimes that is the best thing that happens to you because it makes you, the nerves just went away. I'm like, okay, now I've filed the police report. We've done all of this. Hopefully my house is safe. Oh yeah, I'm going to go down to Maple Leaf Gardens and do this gig. So it maybe in a weird way helped me figure, you know what, you don't sweat the small stuff.
Interesting. Okay. And then tell me about coming out of the in-game host position and becoming a regular reporter. You didn't have that formal training. Who did you go to learn?
Well, and it was interesting because, obviously so many great staff in that first year in 1998, but like with me, I think a lot of people didn't always have the wealth of experience that others would have in the industry because give Sportsnet credit. They did want to give people a shot at things. But I remember feeling like the first interviews that I would do, I remember thinking I knew what I would want to ask them. Again, I've grown up watching hockey my whole life. So for me, and obviously having brothers who played, I knew going into an interview the kind of questions that I would want to ask that player or that coach. But what I didn't really understand was the whole, television side of it, and how, you need to look to the camera or look off to the camera, or being in the edit suite when I would be, with an editor trying to put together my story and writing my scripts. I mean, all the things you learn in broadcast journalism school, I had not learned. And so that first year, wow, I was thrown into the deep end, and it was, really learning on the job. It was on the job training, and fortunately, had a lot of editors. I think of Jeff Dyer, and I think of producers like Steve Lansky, Jeff McDonald, who helped me learn how to do the job. And it's so funny because sometimes the things that are the hardest, like feeling, oh, how do I get an interview with so-and-so? Especially with us, we were a new network. I'm contacting teams and NHL teams in the States, and they're like, yes, sir, who is Sportsnet? Like, we know TSN, we know CBC, but what is this Sportsnet? But I was able to get interviews because by this point, I knew so many people within the hockey world from working at the Hockey Hall of Fame. I mean, I met Gary Bettman, like his first couple of weeks on the job when he was hired as commissioner of the NHL in '93. We were opening the Hall of Fame in the summer of '93. I gave him his first tour of the Hockey Hall of Fame. And I'll remember, especially that year, every NHL team, I had sent out an invitation. Any NHL team that was coming to Toronto to play the Leafs, we gave them the invitation, like, we'd be happy to show your team around the hall. And so I'd be giving teams their first tour of the Hockey Hall of Fame. Still have players saying, oh, I remember meeting you for the first time. You gave our team a tour of the hall the night before we were playing the Leafs. So, so I did bring a certain set of skills to the job with me. But others that I was lacking, it was definitely like on the job training. So those were crazy days. But I figured if I survived those first couple of years, then I figured I could survive anything.
Well, if it makes you feel any better, like as great as school was, I feel like I owe, most of my training to people on the job as well.
Yeah,
for sure.
That's really how you do, right? You're just thrown into it, and it forces you to learn pretty quickly.
Yes. But, like your name did come up as like someone who has been wonderful and kind in a mentorship sort of way on this podcast before, especially with Carolyn Cameron, who I recently spoke with. So that's, awesome. I was thinking about like back then, like, even to be a woman in a position like that back then was very different from today. Did you run into any doubters of the male species?
Oh, it's so funny. I'm sure there were. I guess it's, it was a different world back then in the respect that without any social media, I didn't have to read horrible things about me online like everybody now does. Yes. You know what I mean? So there probably were doubters. Now, as I said, though, I just grew up being comfortable around the rink. I grew up being comfortable around hockey, not only from, my upbringing, but by then, the 5 years before that, I was, working in hockey through the Hall of Fame. I was working at Maple Leaf Gardens every game night for 3 years. So in that respect, even though there weren't a ton of women in these roles, although, I give Teresa Herger and then Teresa Cruz at TSN, give her credit. Lisa Bowes, there were some women in the industry, not many. But I guess I didn't feel it the way that I feel some women do now, just because
True.
It is such a microscope and everyone has a microphone, their own microphone online to be able to say exactly what they think. And sadly, most people don't think twice of saying what they think. I mean, I think maybe there was a bit more of a decorum back then, just generally when you think of the public. Plus, I don't know, I kind of was oblivious. I just thought, put my head down, do my job, and I'll gain respect that way. But again, just lucky enough that I was given the opportunity to be there long enough to really hone whatever skills that I do have now. Because I think if I were to look back at tapes from 1998, I'm sure I would be cringing.
Well, it's funny because like in your bio, it says that you were part of like a history making broadcast in 2020, the first all female NHL broadcast crew for a game. What was it between the
It was
Vegas Golden Knights
in Calgary, and I'll never forget. Yeah, it was myself, Cassie Campbell-Pascal, and Leah Hextall. We were on air, but I mean, most of the production crew too were women, and oh my God, like that wouldn't have been possible 20 years earlier, just because there weren't women in those positions to be able to do it. But that was, I mean, it just reminded me, yeah, we've come a long way. I still feel we've got a ways to go, but boy, have we come a long way that game could even happen.
And although that's like an amazing resume or bio point, I think you have probably made history in the sport before 2020 and this broadcast. So maybe tell me about something sort of groundbreaking that you were part of early days, whether it was in Toronto or you also went to the US for some of your broadcasting career. Do you remember anything feeling like you were breaking new ground?
So funny. You know, I don't know if when you're in it, you don't really realize it. It's more when people, I guess, ask me about it, or maybe if you do look back at something that you kind of realize, you know, you look around and think, oh, right, I guess that kind of hadn't been done so much before at that time. But I guess I mean, one thing, and it's one of the funniest stories that I tell too, just to remind people, you know, young people who are wanting to get into this industry, you just never know when opportunity might come your way, and to almost though always be prepared for it, even though you're probably not ready for it. Part of my job at working at the Hockey Hall of Fame was I would sometimes travel with the Stanley Cup. You know, usually it was Phil Pritchard and Craig Campbell, who are still there today and obviously are the ones that everyone knows as the keepers of the cup. But they would sometimes say, oh, Chris, you know, the cup has to go here. Do you mind taking it? And so those were always fun. So I remember in 95 taking the cup to ESPN. They were
Do you put a seatbelt on it in the car?
You know, it comes in its own trunk. Which a quick story on that front, I had to take it to New York where after the Rangers had won it and Mark Messier wanted the cup for a charity event that he was doing. So of course the Rangers, you know, I fly with it and it comes in this trunk that, you know, you roll. But I come out and they've sent this beautiful stretch limousine for me. And I'm like, well, that's lovely. But like the trunk won't fit into like the limousine part. It's like, oh my gosh. So we actually had to take it out of the trunk and put it in the back seat of the limo. And I'm scared to death thinking if we're stopped and people see what that is, you know, so I'm sort of hanging on to it very tightly. But back to just opportunities, and you never know where you'll find them. That same year I was asked to take the cup to Bristol, Connecticut to the ESPN headquarters. They just wanted to have the cup on display during the playoffs that year. And so that day, they also asked, you know, staff were all welcome to come, get their picture taken with the cup. So I'm there just literally standing beside the cup to have my eye on it, but also people start asking you questions. So I'm telling them about the history of the cup, my own experiences with the cup, because I've been lucky enough to be around the cup a few times before then when my brother had won the Stanley Cup. So before you know it, they're getting ready for showtime, and the coordinating producer of ESPN goes, wow, like that was really cool. You've got some neat stories about what it's like being around the cup. We want you to be on during intermission with Steve Levy talking about the Stanley Cup. So the next thing I know, I'm being whisked into the makeup room, about to make my ESPN debut. And I again though, like, what am I doing here? I should have been scared to death. But you don't have time to really think about it. You just know you're making your broadcast debut on ESPN, seen by however many people. And the funny story is, you know, years later, that's what led to me working games for ESPN, because I'd always kept in touch with the coordinating producer that day and thinking, one of these days, I'm actually going to work with you.
Smart.
So you never know where these opportunities will come. And even though you may be scared to death inside, just don't ever let them see it, right? Never let them see you sweat.
Oh, that's so funny. So you hopefully got to keep that for a demo. Like you got the video from
yeah,
it.
I still have. I got some screen grabs that I post from time to time. Usually because when ESPN just got the rights again in the States, right, last year after NBC's deal went up, ESPN and TNT combined have the NHL rights in the States. And Steve Levy, who had done the interview with me, 30 odd years ago, is back doing ESPN hockey. So I did do a little screen grab of he and I and the cup on the set at ESPN all those years ago. So kind of a full circle moment. That was pretty fun.
I want to ask you about some of your favorite interviews. You probably have stories for days, but give me like an interview that stood out as like you really getting to like the human behind the hockey player that we all see, or maybe it's a Gary Bettman. I don't know.
Well, and there are some that are just a blast to do, and then there are some that are heartbreaking, and those are often the ones that stick with you the most. Yeah. I would say one in particular, Luke Richardson, Luke and his wife Stephanie, when their daughter Darren died by suicide a number of years ago when he was with the Ottawa Senators. And I'd known them both. Luke had been a teammate of my brother Craig's with the Edmonton Oilers. And, anytime anyone in the hockey family, has a loss like that, your heart goes out to them. And then you also think, well, what can I do to help? And I feel for the Richardsons, it was because they wanted to start a foundation, do it for Darren, which is still doing wonderful work in the mental health field, that they decided to open up and tell their story. So those are the ones. I mean, so many of my favorite stories actually are with hockey people, but we're not even talking about hockey. We're talking about something very human. I think of Bobby Ryan. I mean, the Bobby Ryan story is still, and you can't even begin if you don't know the story to know how his father was in jail and they changed their last name and were on the run. And I mean, it's just one of those, like, it's like a movie. But then when he chose to sort of share his story, it's one of those. Nate Thompson a few years ago with the Montreal Canadiens when he opened up about his sobriety. I mean, the things about those stories is that somebody listening to that is going to take something from that and go, oh, if that person is dealing with that and I idolize them, it gives some people hope for whatever, because we all have something we're dealing with. If it gives them hope that they can see a light at the end of the tunnel. So those are the ones that kind of like stick to your heart. But yeah, then there's fun ones. I mean, Wayne Gretzky was always one of the most fun. And to me, one of the most fun ones was when they had the outdoor game in Edmonton.
Was it a winter classic?
The winter classic was a heritage classic. It was before it became a big annual thing, but it was really the first one. And the fun part was, frankly, the alumni game that year was almost more interesting than the regular season game because it did bring – Mark Messier was still playing for the Rangers, but he came back to play with the alumni. It was Wayne Gretzky, it was my brother Craig. And so hopping on the ice after the morning skate and getting to interview Wayne and my brother together on what was the coldest day of the year. I've never been more cold than I was that winter classic. Those were fun. But on the other side of things – again, talking about what you need to do when things change. We were talking about the big picture during a pandemic. Well, we've had a couple of lockouts during my career too.
Oh, yeah.
And then you start thinking, all right, well, if there's no hockey being played. So I was lucky enough to have some connections in Hollywood and started doing segments that we called that Showtime with Chris Simpson. And just during that time, there were a lot of sports movies that came out. So I got connected with a guy out in LA who would get me on to the sports movie junkets. So I got to interview, for Moneyball, I got to interview Brad Pitt. That was pretty cool.
Come on.
Yeah, Brad Pitt.
I love that movie.
And Billy Beane together, right? Brad was playing Billy. So I was out in Oakland interviewing them. Got to interview George Clooney for a football movie, Leatherheads. He and John Krasinski together got to interview him.
I haven't seen that one.
The Longest Yard, got to interview Burt Reynolds and Adam Sandler and Chris Rock. Like, that's the other side of just being able to find, like, again, you find yourself in these scenarios going, how did I get here? And it was really just because needed to come up with stories to tell when there were no hockey stories to tell. So it does sort of force us to become creative when things don't exactly go the way that you plan. But sometimes that's the most fun.
Wow, I'm still digesting the Brad Pitt, but it's so fun. That's such a good movie. I love that movie.
I did too. I know. It's a great movie on top of it.
Where I wanted to go with this next is there's like a boundary for people in the public eye, right? And you see this as you're interviewing people in the hockey spotlight, but you also are in a media spotlight. Have you ever shared something really personal for like a bigger cause than just you, where you sort of stepped outside of that boundary?
Kind of talking about, I guess, awkward conversations that fortunately we're having more of in sports.
Yes.
And I think of, when hockey came back in the bubble, so that would have been late summer of 2020, where they just had the two bubbles. They had games in Toronto, games in Edmonton. So I was doing some of the games in Toronto, now as rinkside reporter, but I was on the 300 level in an empty building, right? No crowds, no one around. Even the camera on me was like robotic. There wasn't a camera person there. So it was weird, but it was just also really great to have hockey back. But if you'll also recall, that was the summer of George Floyd. That was, social justice was becoming, in the sports world in particular, you saw the NBA players speaking out so strongly, just with every horrific thing that happened. I think in part because everyone was home, everyone was watching TV, like you had nothing else going on. And it just became the summer of change and the summer of the ugly side of our world, all of us being forced to see it. And I'll never forget the day where, because of the whole George Floyd situation, the NBA basically canceled their game. So you've got leagues playing, like telling their fans, nope, we're taking a break, that we can't just pretend that sports is fine, we can keep going. And so we're sitting there thinking our game, like, well, the NHL has to follow suit. The game has to be suspended. Like, how can we? Like, the world is blowing up. How can we just pretend everything's fine? So we were kind of dumbfounded when, the NHL didn't cancel anything. We had to do the game. And I just remember that day, and I was sitting with Chris Johnston, who was working with us at the time, and just felt sick. We felt complicit. Like, how are we supposed to just talk about a game of hockey when there are just so many bigger things going on in the world right now? And on social media, people are screaming at the NHL saying, how can you be so tone deaf? Like, you've got to suspend play too. So what I remember, though, was the first intermission, and, my producer's in my ear, and this is normally where CJ and I would be breaking down the first period. We both sort of looked at each other and said, we can't. So I was there, and I'm like, well, Chris, this is normally where we break down what happened in the first period. But given, I think you and I feel this is a game that shouldn't even be played, and I actually feel sick to my stomach that it's being played, I don't think we can do that. And so our discussion, and honestly, we didn't really get permission to talk about it. But I remember thinking, I don't know if this is the last game I'm going to do for Sportsnet and the National Hockey League, but how can you just pretend that everything is fine?
You have to listen to your gut.
You have to go with your gut, right? And so I remember that getting a call the next day from our president at the time. And again, you don't know what, but fortunately to say, just want you to know, proud of what you said, proud of what you did. We have your back, and we are not going to stifle you. And trust me, I know that doesn't always happen that way. And I don't always like to use it as like, I'm going to get on my soapbox because this is something that I'm personally, very passionate about. But in that moment, you just had to. And whatever consequences came, I think we were ready.
You were up for it.
Yeah. So that's just one. And I mean, obviously that's been the start of so much happening in our sport. And, you know, the Hockey Diversity Alliance being, well, Matt Dumba, shortly after that, his impassioned speech that he gave before an NHL game will stick with me. The work that the HDA is doing, the work that the Carnegie Initiative is doing, the fact that Herb Carnegie was just inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame. I mean, we are seeing change in sport in general. And hockey, I feel, has lagged behind, but we are making headway. And those are the things I'm probably, you know, most proud of when I look at the diversity that has come, you know, in all ways, and to the point where I'm looking forward to my interview with Mike Greer next week as the first Black GM in the NHL. I mean, again, ridiculous that it's taken this long, but glad that it has. Glad to see more women, not only in sports broadcasting, but in the head offices, in management with NHL teams. So yeah, we're getting there. Slowly but surely, we're getting there.
Thinking about sort of the up and coming generations in broadcasting, it's funny how many parallels there are from what you're seeing in the league or on the ice with representation to broadcasting as a career behind the mic, behind the scenes. I imagine that you're asked to speak to schools, classes, people coming up in journalism or broadcasting. Are there any interesting questions that you're being asked that you're sort of like, I've never thought about that before, because it's such a different generation?
I often find it's the other way, is that I want to ask them. Keep in mind, when I started in 92, there was no social media, podcasts, like what's a podcast? Like, there are so many platforms now. Like, I want to find, like, how do you watch a hockey game? Do you watch our game start to finish? And a lot of young people, well, no, I just go to the highlights on YouTube. Oh, okay. What YouTube channels do you like to watch? What podcasts do you like to listen to? And I always ask them, because I figure they're going to know before me, what are the next platforms? Again, Twitter didn't exist. Instagram didn't exist. Facebook.
Twitter's about to not exist again.
Exactly. So I'd be asking the same. It's like, okay, what if Twitter continues to go the way that it seems to be going and blows up? Where are we all going to go to next? So where they might be asking me, you know, what advice do you have? How do I get my foot in the door? I'm saying to many of them, well, the way we all got our foot in the door, even though there wasn't, as we said, no one path, there were very different ways of getting into the industry, but those ways continue to be different. So advice even from a decade ago of, well, you start in a local news channel and you do sports there. Yeah. Well, there aren't many local news channels anymore to even get your start there to work.
You could start on TikTok at this point.
And that's the thing. Like, to me, I would just say there are so many opportunities for people because you can be your own platform, right? You know, I look at Steve Dangle and the work he's doing with us. He created what he created out of his basement, and look at him now. And the fact that, be it podcasts or whatever platform, and whatever platforms are still to come, you're not going to be someone who like waits there and sends out, like I did, cobbles together a VHS tape of some things that I've done and have to send this tape in the mail to a company to say, hey, look at what I can do for you. Let me know if you have a role to fill. To me, you can find your own following. And if you're creative and you can, work hard at it and create content, all of these platforms are looking for content. So be your own producer, be your own content creator. Like, in that respect, you have better luck of being seen than we ever did, because you'd have to at least get your foot in the door to get that interview. Whereas to me now, I just love the creativity that you see from the TikTokers and as I said, whatever platform is to come next. So I do often have young people reach out to me, and I'm always happy to share my insight, to share my story. But I also make it very clear, my path is not the path you're going to follow, because it kind of doesn't exist anymore. And I'm always fascinated by what they're doing and what their perception of, how, not just how I want to get into the industry, what is the industry now?
It's such a good question.
Right?
It's like,
I don't know.
yeah.
And
Yeah,
I don't
it's
know
a
where
very
it's
good
going.
question.
But that's also exciting because I do feel in certain ways there are more opportunities out there because you don't have to have a big corporation decide what's good content or not. You can come up with it, and you're always going to find, a community that wants to share that.
Mm-hmm. Follow-up question on the next generation. What's a great piece of advice or something you learned from someone up and coming?
Oh, well, I would say just to be able to diversify. And I look at Carolyn Cameron is a great example. And she is such a powerhouse at our place. I am lucky. I feel we are lucky as a hockey department that she's with us. But, she started as an anchor, doing everything. And her genuine love for tennis has gotten her over to the tennis side. And then, lo and behold, a couple of years ago, it's like, let's steal her from Sportsnet Central from the news side and have her do hockey. And I mean, I just marvel at everything that she's able to do. Like, you can just throw her into anything and she's like, yep, what do you need? Yep, I can do it. And I give her such credit. I remember when I was starting out at Sportsnet in 98, we had 2 reporters. So I would be thrown to, I remember going out to Woodbine and having to cover a horse race. And it was the first time I'd ever been to a horse race. And I always felt especially as a woman, you need to know your stuff inside and out. Or, someone's going to say, oh, she doesn't know what she's talking about. So that's what would make me nervous. And I felt very fortunate for them to decide that, you know what? Hockey is where you're best utilized anyway. So you're going to be, and all of a sudden I'm like, whew, okay, I can do hockey and do my thing. But, I look at someone like Carolyn and just nothing ever seems to ruffle her. And she's worn so many hats and everywhere along the way, she's just like, yep, what do you need me to do? So the confidence, and I mean, she might say, oh, but I'm not super confident when I'm doing it. But you don't know it because she's just so smooth no matter what you throw at her, that I'm very impressed by her. And that's where I know, like, the future of Sportsnet is bright when someone like her is at the helm.
I'm very curious about your time in the U.S.
Oh, well, the beauty of it, I was working at Sportsnet as well as, so did the years, because it started at Sportsnet in 98, so it was maybe coming out of a lockout in the early 2000s, 2002. Anyway, when ABC and ESPN had the rights, I would do just some games for them, rinkside reporting. So it was here and there, and the
flights in and out.
Yeah, so like I never had to move anywhere with any of the.
Okay.
Well, that's the beauty of it. When you're doing games, you just fly. Like, it doesn't matter where you live; you fly to where the games are.
True.
So, and then out of that, after the lockout, where ABC and ESPN, I had done some games for them, rinkside reporting, and then a cable network that doesn't exist anymore called Versus got the NHL rights coming out of that lockout. And some of the people that I'd worked with at ESPN were now working at Versus. So same thing, they came to me saying, we would like you to do rinkside for some of our games. Luckily, Sportsnet saw that as an advantage, because if Versus was flying me down to New York to do a Rangers game one week, Sportsnet would say, great, when she's there, we'll keep her for an extra day. She'll get an interview with one of the New York Rangers and come back and give us content. So I look at those years as being the busiest I've ever had, because you're basically working for 2 networks on the road. Like, 1 game a week means 3 days a week on the road, in addition to whatever else Sportsnet needed me to do. So they were the craziest of times, but the most fun, and the way that you do build the relationships that you do with the people that you're interviewing. I mean, even if you're doing rinkside reporting for a game and are doing just a 30 to 40 second intermission interview with a player, you might find out something about that player that you want to then take back with pitch them on a real story. Like, can I now come to your home and do a real sit down with you and your family talking about whatever issue it was that, you uncover from being there? So I think so much of really the relationships that I've built throughout the hockey world
Yeah.
has come from working both sides of the border with numerous networks, and just doing it long enough that people, you've been doing this long enough when I'm now interviewing the sons of hockey players that I used to interview Ty Domi. Now I interview Max Domi. And all the guys that I started out interviewing are now the coaches and the GMs and management of teams. But it's all great because it's still like they know who I am. They know they can trust me if I'm coming to do a story. Even if it's a story that, is maybe an uncomfortable conversation. I think by now people know my reputation is not gotcha journalism. My reputation is to make you feel comfortable enough that we're having a conversation and that people are going to learn something about you or your organization, in a comfortable way, even if it's an uncomfortable topic.
Okay, so the age piece. This is a pretty hot topic in the media right now. You walked me right into this. I'm 35 and I'm like, oh, do I expire next year? Like, that's how it feels,
Yep.
How have you sort of handled your age? I mean, there's no doubt about it that like you've got a great reputation, you are well presented, all of that. But I'm sure there has been moments over your career where you've been challenged on those things.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I am happy to say I'm 58 years old, and
hell yeah,
and been doing this for so long, and certainly still hope to be doing it for at least a while longer. Put it this way, I'm pretty darn sure that I will not have the longevity of some of my male colleagues who worked into their 80s. It's just not the way it works. But I'm going to do everything I can to make it difficult for my network to say, we don't really need you anymore. I will give my network credit in that there's no question. They could replace me at any time with someone half my age, I'm sure half my salary. They absolutely could. And that person could do this job. They maybe couldn't do it the same way that I do. They maybe couldn't land certain interviews that I can land because of people trusting me and knowing me and that kind of thing. So I've, as I said, up to this point, been fortunate enough that I feel they understand the value that I bring to the network. But hey, don't get me wrong. I mean, Lisa LaFlamme is one of my dearest and closest friends. And to see what happened with her this summer, I am very well aware that could happen to me at any time. Now, one would think that given the outcry that came after Lisa being let go, perhaps that will make networks think twice about making decisions like that. But hey, it's the reality of our industry. And all I want to do is make it difficult for them to say, yeah, you know what, we don't really need someone like her here anymore. I always just think, put your head down, do your job the best that you can, bring value to your network, and make it difficult for them to think, oh, what would we do without her? Or, how could we land that interview without her? But yeah, it is the reality of life in general, but certainly our industry in particular, that age is a factor. But
I got to flip this back on you. When you said, oh, I've felt fortunate, you've said like you're grateful, right? You're always using these terms, and many women in this industry are.
Yeah.
I think it's the networks that are fortunate and should be grateful. So sorry, just had to say that to wrap us up here.
I do appreciate that. I do hope they feel that way too.
Oh, come on. They do. So I end the podcast with like a little nomination process. Who you would love to hear more about their story in a format like this, conversation about their career. This is basically a profile podcast. So yeah, who are you thinking?
Well, I know you've already talked to a lot of women that I admire in media. So you've already got a great roster, I know, in your archives. But when I look ahead, so a couple of things come to mind, and actually just because we just talked about her, obviously, Lisa LaFlamme. She's an incredible human being and has had an incredible career up until this point, and I know will continue to. The exciting thing is going to be seeing where she's going to land next. So she'd be a great one for you to get to know. But, you know, I think back to, we also talked about that all-female broadcast that we did of that NHL game in Calgary back in 2020 on International Women's Day. And the two women I worked with on that game that day, Cassie Campbell-Pascal, still a colleague of mine at Sportsnet, and Leah Hextall, who has gone on, and I mean, I give her so much credit for play-by-play. Like, it's enough to, you know, be a reporter, be an analyst, but play-by-play, in my mind, like, for anybody,
whole other beast.
Hardest job. It is such a completely different beast. And for her to have spent so many nights going to junior hockey games, you know, in Manitoba, and calling the game into her phone to listen back to it and to like hone her craft basically on her own. And now to see the great things that she's doing, to me, Leah Hextall and Cassie Campbell-Pascal would be two other ladies that I would highly recommend you speak to.
Okay, well, thank you so much for those names. Thank you so much for the time. And if anyone's missed an interview that they want to check out, where's the best place to head to find all of your content?
All of my speaking of all the different platforms, yes. Well, usually Sportsnet will tweet out any of the big pictures that I do. I'll retweet them on my socials at SN Chris Simpson, our Sportsnet YouTube channel, our website sportsnet.ca. All of the platforms, you can find my stuff there.
We'll make sure that the links are in the episode notes for you. I realize that we just got to make it easy sometimes.
Exactly. Make it foolproof.
Thank you so much. It was so nice to speak to you.
Sarah, it was lovely to meet you, and appreciate the time that we spent.
I've put the Mike Greer interview directly in the episode notes and in the body of the page on my website. Womeninmedia.ca is where you can find all the previous episodes. If you think of a guest that you would like to hear more about who has not been on this podcast yet, please get in touch. Thank you so much for listening, and back with a new episode for you in 2 weeks.
Don't skip this ad. I saw your finger. You were trying to skip the ad. I didn't want to do this, and now we're stuck in it together. I'm Ryan. I'm the host of The Linz Report. The Linz Report is a snarky, humorous, yet balanced look at the headlines that fill your timeline every day. We're going to get straight to the point without muddying any of the waters. And remember, The Linz Report is not your parents' news commentary. We swear a lot here, like a whole lot. So tune in and subscribe on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and find us at CryerMedia.co or wherever you get your fine podcasts, like they say at the end of all of these ads. It's podcasting. Why are we doing ads?
Another Sound Off Media Company podcast.